Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bible Thumper podcast. My name is Patrick Hayes. I'm your regular host, and with me is your regular co-host, Caleb Jenks from down in Waco, Texas. How are you doing tonight, Caleb?
Good.
Good.
I feel like I should just assume the title of co-host. That's like co-pilot. That's
Well,
like I'm almost as important as you. It's just like I'm only important if you die. And
yeah, then you take over the controls and
exactly.
Yeah. Well, and really, like so co-host is the same as host. It's just that I'm introducing the two of us. So if you were to introduce the show, you would say, "Hi, I'm your host, Caleb Jenks, and with me tonight is my co-host is equal, isn't it? I mean, that's what I always figured.
Sure. Yeah, just like co-pilot. Yep.
Is that no co-pilot?
Absolutely. There's no hurt. There's no hurt feelings here at all. You can. You're number one. I'm number two. There's no hurt feelings.
I'll start saying tonight, my name is Patrick Hayes. I am the co-host of the far superior Caleb Jenks down in Waco, Texas. Caleb, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself? Okay, so with that, we're a minute 30 in, and hopefully this is coming on, and people are going to start seeing this and joining us. We are talking about, can I just have church up in the mountains every weekend? So, Caleb, what do you think? I'm going to hold back a little bit and let you talk for a second. And I'll be happy to answer any of your questions or comments, but I'm not going to hijack the show by starting off. I think I picked this one. Do you remember?
Yeah, you did.
This was mine.
It's kind of funny because we were running through it. I was like, oh, sure, why not? And then I was like, wait, what did he say? I actually told my wife earlier, I was like, of all the episodes, this one I put zero thought into, and that's just fine because I don't know what I would think about anyways.
Sure.
But no, it's kind of funny because I used to live in Colorado, so church in the mountains would have been something that you do. Down here, there's every once in a while you find an anthill. So there's no such thing as mountains in Texas.
There's not really much in the way of mountains.
But I guess church in the wilderness, you could have church in your backyard or your cow pasture down here.
Okay, so let's start off by defining our terms. Okay, what I mean by this is I see it as an excuse by a lot of liberal, nonsensical Christians who try to redefine terms and basically give themselves an excuse for not getting together with other believers. So they are not corporately worshiping with other believers. And keep in mind, I feel like we don't even need to say this, but we have to have a caveat before we go any further. Neither Caleb nor I are saying that your church needs to meet in a church building. You can hold your church service in homes. You can hold your church service in caves. Those have been done by very successful, powerful Christian groups throughout centuries. We're not saying it has to be in a building with a steeple and bells. That's not what we're saying. Okay, and Caleb, please correct me, if you feel something differently than what I just said. But what I'm saying is that you hanging out by yourself in the mountains or with a friend going hiking, that is not in any way the definition found in the Bible for church, corporate worship with other Christians. Would you agree? Tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm just hoping we're not going to offend John the Baptist here, or I mean John the Revelator here. He seemed to have, he was kind of off on his own, but that was actually really a form of persecution. So it's almost like a self-inflicted persecution when we decide to isolate ourselves from God's people.
Wonderful.
I guess you thought I was gonna have a longer thought. So
yeah,
we have our captions on here. We'll see how this works out. I'm not sure how this got turned on. I don't know if you have to pay extra for this service or not, but
Well, I guarantee you the people that are going to be listening to us later on Apple or Google or Spotify are not going to care about the captions. So I don't know if we need to worry about those, just yet. But
So have you had experience with church in the mountains type of a ideology? Have you ever known anybody that really did that, or was kind of this mindset of they didn't want church, didn't need church for whatever the reason? I think it would be interesting to go over some of those reasons, but have you ever experienced that
okay,
yourself?
so the only thing I've ever experienced is, talking to some, um, you know, talking to somebody who basically doesn't want to go to church, and they're writing it off as an excuse and saying, "Oh, I have church in the mountains." They go hiking every weekend. And wait, we just got an echo. It just started coming in. Okay, it's already been fixed. Don't worry about it. So I've always heard of people, using that as an excuse. They're like, "Oh, I have church in the mountains every weekend." "Oh, really? What's that like?" "Well, I go fishing." Okay, you see what I'm saying? Or I go hiking, or I go camping, or I go, and it's like, that's not what church is. If you want to say that you enjoy being outdoors, that's fine. And if you want to say you enjoy God's creation, that's fine. But stop redefining terms and making it sound like no matter what you do on Sunday, that's church, because it's not. Okay, church, a local church has offices. The Bible talks about it. There's pastors, there's deacons, there's elders. The church has responsibilities. The church, members of the church have responsibilities and privileges. It talks about how we are supposed to gather together. We're supposed to assemble, meaning everyone in that local body gets together in one location for a purpose. And I think the idea of this title, and keep in mind we put these titles together months ago, so what I was thinking when I went over this was Christians making excuses for not wanting to be in a local body. And can I tell you why I think people do that? They don't want any accountability. Because the fact is, I am accountable to the people that I go to church with. When they see me, they can get a reading on how I'm doing. They can ask me how I'm doing. They can show concern. They can ask questions. They can pray with me if I'm going through a hard time. Okay, we can. That is where I can get filled. That is where I can go to get better. That is where I can go to learn about God. That is where I can go to learn underneath somebody that has put time and energy into studying prayerfully something about the Bible, and they're going to give that to me. And that the Bible literally says that they are going to feed me. Okay, that's something that I need. So I think the whole idea of this topic is just to pop that little balloon of all the people that say, "Oh yeah, I go fishing every weekend and that's church for me." No, it's not. Stop saying that. If that's church, then I'm an astronaut. Okay, just because you use a term doesn't make it so. Words have meaning. Stop using church incorrectly. You sound stupid, and I'm sick of hearing it. Bless their heart.
Just a word to the wise. Patrick told me he was in a grouchy mood tonight, so
yeah,
we'll see if we can get through the next 50 minutes of this.
Yeah, if I can make it through without cursing, I'm going to count it in the win column. Expect no spiritual nourishment from me whatsoever. So you better direct the conversation in the right direction.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting that you brought up the idea of maybe the number one, or the first thing that comes to your mind as far as why somebody would choose to stay away from church and go off, hide in the woods, is because they don't want any accountability. And that is, so I have firsthand experience with this subject because I grew up out of church, doing a home church some of the time, no church some of the time, most of the time. There was very, very, very few times that we had actually regular dedicated times to actually reading God's words together as a family or with other Christians. And I saw the danger in that. And when my wife and I got married, I told her, no matter what, I don't care how much I get out of it, we're going to be in church every Sunday. I want to make sure that we're in church every Sunday. And I said the main reason for that is because I want the accountability. So that is what I see as the danger behind not having that is, well, a lot of us, I mean, I think you and I probably both had our fair share of disappointment in church, disappointment in looking around and seeing the difference between God's word and then what we see actually happening around us, and noticing that difference. And it's easy to get disillusioned and end up really high-minded and saying, hey, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm just going to go off on my own, and I'm going to be way holier than what I see in church. I can't find any church that's good enough for me, you know, whatever the motivations are. So it may actually come out as originally as a good intention of not wanting to get drugged down by the mediocrity that we see around us in the church and wanting to live a life that's more dedicated to God. But that can lead into this dangerous trap of thinking that we're somehow okay and we're off on our own. We don't need anybody else. And next thing you know, we turn into these reckless monsters that start hurting everybody around us, everything around us. And I've seen it. I knew a lot of other, you know, homeschool family, Christian families that were home church and too good to go to church on Sunday kind of a thing. And I saw the dangers where you can end up, you know, way off your rocker and not have any idea. And I may be off my rocker, but at least I have to show up and be civil at least one day of the week at church.
That's a great point, you know, because and I should say this. I don't ever want anyone to believe what Caleb and I tell you on this podcast, ever. I want everyone to question everything we say. I want you to go to your Bible. I want you to find answers there. And I want you to prove us wrong whenever you can. Okay, that is the challenge that everyone needs to accept if they're going to listen to this Bible Thumper podcast, because we're just two guys that love the Bible and love God, and we're doing our best to learn the Bible and talk about it, and we enjoy doing it. You know, but with that being said, it is in church where my beliefs are challenged. Okay, my beliefs are not challenged in my home. My home is going to often be an echo chamber. Now, once in a while, my wife and I will talk about things and we'll disagree about stuff in the Bible and we'll talk it out, you know, and I certainly enjoy that and encourage that.
You and your wife disagree on things sometimes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, here's a verse I have for you. The Bible says not to be unequally yoked. It says, how can two walk together unless they be agreed? All right, so you might need to rethink this whole marriage thing and church too, because if there's people at church you disagree with, I've heard those scriptures quoted.
Get out of here.
People have a disagreement in church. They're like, well, how can two walk together unless they be agreed? And so therefore, I don't agree with him, so I'm going to leave church. Or I can't be unequally yoked with these non-believers because they don't believe the way I believe.
You know, I don't doubt that. I mean, I really don't. Why do so many Christians love the extremes? You know, and this is coming from me, so I understand, you know, how ridiculous that might sound to some of you. But seriously, you know, I guess I don't get it. There are so many things that it's easy to disagree on. You know, people that run after them and try to find a problem with them, you know, it doesn't make sense to me. You know, so last week we talked about predestination versus free will. And I saw someone that commented after our conversation sometime through the week that clearly listened to the podcast. And he said, nope, you guys are wrong. God planned out purposely every disease, every war, every event for his glory and his purpose. And so he clearly, you know, very much disagreed with the idea that we kind of expressed. Well, that's great. I thought it was great that guy made that comment. I think it's great that he listened to the podcast. I hope he comes back and listens every time. I don't want him to stop coming. I would love to have a conversation with that guy. There's no reason for me, because of one disagreement, you know, to run away from a church or a podcast or a friend or family member or any of these things, you know. With that being said, it is in church where I oftentimes get my beliefs challenged. And I'll tell you this, Caleb, and you tell me if you think this is crazy. More specifically than church, for me, it's in Sunday school. I love the Sunday school hour. I'm a big fan of that. I know it's not popular in a lot of churches, but I love the time when we can sit around a table and open up our Bible and we can study the Bible together. We can ask questions, we can have a dialogue, and we can bring up different things and, and really get into it. And I like that because it's the opportunity, or that's the time when we're given the opportunity to ask questions, to challenge each other's beliefs, and that's okay. Whereas during the what we might call the sermon, or the kind of the teaching time that a lot of church has, I'm sitting there and I'm listening to the message that the pastor or the preacher of the day prepared, and that's great, and he can still challenge me. But I really enjoy the time where we can kind of go back and forth and try to figure out the Bible together. And I only get that in a church where there is corporate worship going on, and I'm around other brothers and sisters, and we get in the Word. When I'm hiking off in the woods with my kids, I'm enjoying nature, and that's great. But I don't know about you, I'm not really thinking about God a whole lot. I'm certainly not really singing to him. I'm not praying to him much. I'm mostly, trying to keep track of all my kids and make sure that I have them all, make sure there's sunscreen applied wherever it needs to be. I'm enjoying God's creation, but it is so different from the idea of church. So, Caleb, tell me what some what's a downfall that you saw in not having a regular church attendance as a kid. You talked about how you didn't really have regularity. Tell me what you see now as far as what's the benefit. What did you see that you were missing from when you were younger?
So if you think about the two greatest commandments, Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? The scribes and Pharisees asked him.
Sure.
And he said, love the Lord your God.
Regular coffee. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Anyways, so he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mm-hmm. And then he said that he went on to the second commandment, which mm-hmm. is to love your neighbor as yourself. And I find it to be interesting with a lot of Christians that I go to church with, or that I've seen in church, however much I may disagree with them on theology or practice of this or that or holiness or whatever it might be. I generally find the conversations at church to be loving, encouraging, lifting each other up, and in circles of people that were more isolationist, where they were not going to go to church because they were too good for church for whatever reason. It tends to be more negative, bashing, and it's, when I think about, if you go isolate yourself off from, and you cut yourself off from the body, and that is part of, the body of Christ is part of the lifeblood that flows through us as we learn to love one another, then you really don't ever have a chance. How can you, if you're isolated up in the mountains as a hermit, so to speak, even spiritually, if you just isolate yourself, how can you ever put into practice the idea of being able to bear one another's burdens and love your neighbor as yourself? And it's really interesting, because when God put us here, he clearly put us here knowing that relationships weren't always going to be friendly. Relationships weren't always going to be easy. We're going to have friends that sometimes we don't necessarily even like them that much. Quite frankly, there's days that I wake up and I don't even want to be in the same room as myself. But sometimes there's some character and there's definitely can be some growth by us submitting ourselves one to another and learning to work together and being able to be challenged by somebody that we disagree with. And I find that you can become extremely intolerant when you are cut off from everybody that doesn't think exactly the way that you are. You get yourself in this little echo chamber, and you can become extremely intolerant of really, really good people that actually have values that you should be learning from, values that should be rubbing off on you. And instead, you're over there, thumbing your nose at them because you're better than them because they don't have this belief or that belief. And that's really what I have found, is that sometimes by us learning to humble ourselves and submit to imperfect people as brothers and sisters in Christ, and have that accountability come from people that aren't perfect, that God can use it to make us more perfect or more like him, as opposed to us just cutting it off. So that was, I would say, the biggest thing that I would say was the negative. And there's other things for sure, but that was the biggest, most practical thing that I would say to somebody is you can't, the Bible says, how can you love God who you can't see if you don't love your neighbor who you can see? Actually, I think I worded that backward. But anyways, if you can't love your neighbor who you can see, how can you love God? Or your brother who you can't see, how can you love God who you can't see? I should look the scripture up before I try to butcher it 10 more times here. But anyways,
I don't think that's in the Bible. I don't know if I've ever come across that one. I know
Okay, I'll
that's
pull it
a
up here.
song lyric. I've heard that in a song. There's a bluegrass song that says, "You don't if you don't love your neighbor, then you don't love God." Anyway, I was going to say, you got it.
Okay.
You got a verse.
Well, I butchered it pretty bad.
Okay, first, it's almost completely different.
1 John 4:20 says, if a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. Yet no one can claim to love God who hates his brother. We cannot love the unseen God when we hate the brother who is in God's image. And I think that if you go, I grew up reading NIV, and so I believe the NIV words it a little bit closer to my original quote. But anyways, it's so frustrating. I memorized about half of Genesis in the NIV, and then I tried to go back through and memorize it in King James Version, and it's messed me up so bad.
Yeah. Oh, I bet that nearly inspired version is a number on anybody that reads it. Hey, so I was going to bring up a Bible verse that went along with what you were talking about having, people hold you accountable. That I forget where the verse is. Maybe you can recall the book, but it's a famous verse that talks about, how iron sharpeneth itself. So you only need to be one person by yourself in the mountains. And, we all remember how you can take a knife and use it to sharpen itself, right? I mean, that's the beautiful thing about knives. So and that's really the thing is when I'm around other people, I think I'm going to be a healthier, more rounded Christian. It seems like so one of my favorite jokes with Caleb is when we're talking about like crazy, off the wall weirdo cults. And I always add the phrase, yep, they're about ready to start purchasing some razor wire, it's like, because you always have to isolate yourself and then surround the compound with razor wire. Like that's just one of the steps sooner or later, but that never happens until they isolate themselves and they seem to go off, in the middle of nowhere and don't let anyone else in and, and become this cloistered, society. And that for me has never been healthy. What's best for me is to be in regular contact with different Christians who love me and want the best for me. And they are able to call me out when I'm off on a weird path, thinking about, something foolish or going down a road that's just silly and unbiblical. They can, rein me back in and get me grounded in the Bible again. So let me just ask if anyone can throw out a question for us, or let's get our audience involved. We have at least a couple people listening in. Does anyone have any comments or ideas or questions about just having church up in the mountains every weekend? Or is this conversation even making any sense to anybody?
Yeah, so I actually have thought about doing a podcast at some point just about some of the crazy, when you read through church history, as far as some of the things that have happened in history where Christians have done some really, really stupid stuff. And you kind of wonder, where did they get so far off that this seemed like this was a good idea? I listen to a radio show sometimes, and it's a radio show down here. It's called Masons Morons, and they talk about these criminals that would just do stupid things. And every morning they go through a list of like 10 criminals that have done really stupid things. And I keep thinking, man, if you look through church history, you could find a lot of good Christians, church going Christians, that would give them a run for their money with stupidity. And sometimes I think that we end up off in the weeds so bad if we don't have each other there to help us keep on the straight and narrow. I mean, I know obviously, I look at it and I would say you can be saved, you can go to heaven, you can become a Christian outside of church. That's not not really what we're talking about, but we're talking about as far as the benefits of actually being a Christian and what it means to actually be a part of the church and why we're supposed to, why does the Bible say not to forsake the gathering together and breaking bread? Why does it say to submit ourselves one to another? And those are things where, like I said, God knew when he designed us, not only did he design us for a relationship with him, but for a relationship with each other. And he knew that there was going to be conflict. He knew we were going to want to kill each other sometimes. He knew we were going to want to steal each other's stuff. Mm-hmm. He knew that we were going to be, have all these evil tendencies, and yet he still created us anyways and gave us this opportunity to work together and to serve. And so I think that this comes almost, in Jesus's words, it was second only to loving God is loving each other. And it's pretty impossible to love each other when we just isolate ourselves. So I was going to tell a couple of thoughts that I had on this, since I kind of have some experience with it.
Yeah, let me hear it.
This is not to step on any toes. I have friends that watch this, and so some of these stories are going to come from friends, but I'm not going to name anyone.
Pull your feet in.
But there's some common sense that goes a long ways in the way that we relate to each other and the way that we relate to our families, our wives, our children. And sometimes we can get so off the rails emotionally, tied up in our faith, which is good to have faith, don't get me wrong. But sometimes I've known people that their faith took them so far out of the way where they missed so many red flags where God could have stopped them and saved them from trouble if they would have just been in a situation where somebody would have been like, "Hey, bro, what's up?
Yeah, what are you doing out there?"
So, and of course, this is an extreme version of where this can go, but I think that it would ring true to a lot of people, and they could probably relate to it. So I had some friends that they took a Bible verse. The father in the family took a Bible verse where it talks about fleeing to the mountains. And so he took his family and he fled to the mountains. Well, it wasn't really mountains, but he got completely out of Dodge. And they were home church out in the middle of nowhere, isolated on a farm.
Just that one family.
Just the one family, nobody else.
And he took that one verse as God speaking directly to him.
I think there was some conflicts and some individuals that he had some conflict with, and he lived right down the road from where I did when we were growing up, and so there were some conflicts there. And of course, the city was growing, and he was looking at some of these end times verses that talk about fleeing to the mountains. So he took his family and he decided to flee from the wrath that was to come by living in the city. And so they did home church, and along the way, no fellowship. Every once in a while we would see them. We remained friends over the years. No fellowship, and along the way there was times where there was things that came up health-wise with the children. And at one point there was a child that was born and was malnourished. I'm not sure what the deal was. Maybe the mother's production was down, if I remember right, and the child was malnourished. Well, the father and the family felt like God spoke to him that they were supposed to give her some corn syrup at one point. And so they gave her some water and corn syrup, and it immediately revived her. Like she was way better, I think, because of probably the blood sugar spike. And so they continued feeding this baby water and corn syrup for a long time.
Like regularly. Wow.
And eventually the baby ended up so sick that they were praying for the baby that it wasn't going to die, and still following, what seemed like the wisdom that he had from God. And eventually they did take the baby to the hospital, but it seemed like it was too late. They lost the baby. They ended up investigated for, from the state for neglect or whatever.
Sure.
And all of this was done in a situation where I believe if there would have been brothers in the church that they were praying with, if they would have been a part of a church, somebody would have said, you need to take the baby to the doctor, or you need to, or maybe even not take it to the doctor, but hey, it can't live on corn syrup and water, or whatever it would have been.
It's not a honeybee.
And so somewhere along the line, that little girl could be alive today. So that's kind of a worst case scenario. But along the way, there was other things that happened in that family, and I'm not going to go into the other details. But I knew there's other things that happened where it was like, man, if there would have been the accountability of being in a church in the city where all these hypocrites live that you don't like and you're trying to get away from, maybe your children wouldn't have had to go through this and experience that because of the fact that they grew up with no friends and whatever. So that's an example of kind of an extreme example, but it's really true that we do need each other, and sometimes we can end up so far off, um, so far off of kind of the mainstream beaten path of general wisdom. And so when God says that we are the iron that sharpens iron, it doesn't mean that he thinks that somebody else that's with us is perfect. We don't, it doesn't have to be perfect iron to sharpen the iron, but sometimes we need somebody to whack us over the head with a 2x4 and say, hey, wake up, you're way off left field. And sometimes I will say, I can say this for sure, sometimes accountability is not fun. Sometimes we have somebody there telling us something that we do not want to hear, but we need to hear it anyways. And so I think that a lot of times that is, the one of the main benefits is accountability. And I think there's some other things, but I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Well, no, what I was hearing the whole time you were explaining that, and before when you were sharing, it sounds like God knew what he was doing when he set up a church. And a church was, a group of believers that would come together and worship God together. They were a group that would meet regularly. They were a group that was part of each other's lives. They were a group that would help each other when they fell on hard times. But every instance of a church in the Bible is a group. I mean, a big one or a small one, and where they meet doesn't matter, but it was always a group. And whether you want to believe that the church is the, worldwide, universal, and visible church, which constitutes every believer, or whether you want to believe it's a local church, like we've talked about before, it's always a group. And, that's just what kept screaming to me is God knew what he was talking about when he set this thing up. We need each other. We have to have each other. We're good for each other. And have you ever noticed how much of the New Testament is written to the churches about how to get along with each other, how to resolve conflict with one another? Okay, well, how does that work if you're having church up in the mountains by yourself while you're fishing in a pond? Okay, you don't need to know human relations and conflict resolution like the Bible talks about in Matthew 18. None of that is important. It only works when there's a group. Okay, so we had a question here from Josh, who said, how would you define having church? And the follow-up was, what constitutes a true church? So Caleb, what are your thoughts on that as far as how would you define having church?
Well, I would say having church of what we think of it now and what the Bible is referring to when it talks about the church.
Yeah. Go with the Bible. Let's just go with the Bible.
Well, it can be two totally separate things, but when in the early church, it talks about them meeting together and them gathering together and praying and fasting together. And so I would say, as far as the definition of church, I disagree with Patrick on one thing. He said it doesn't have to have a steeple and a bell. I'll agree with the steeple thing, but the bell, you got to have a bell, man.
You got to have some
that
bells.
Bell.
What are you
That's
talking
really
about?
No. So there can be churches that take form in all different sizes and variations. Some are home churches, some meet in a field, some meet in a huge mega church building. I tend to think that we should be the salt of the earth, and that if you get too much salt in one spot, that it tends to be a little unsavory. And so I tend to kind of be more along. I like smaller churches where you actually know everybody in the church. I like the idea of us being more effective in that way and not so much money getting absorbed by these, multi-million-dollar organizations that just can suck, your resources out without being that effective. But that's my personal opinion. And I think God works through various different sizes and types and whatever. The biggest thing that I would say when I think of church is an organization of like-minded or not believers. Patrick tends to think that you should all be pretty like-minded. You mentioned at one point about that it's pretty hard to have fellowship when you're all fighting over doctrine and stuff. And I think that's true. I actually really enjoy being a part of a non-denominational, pretty diverse church where people really have a lot of different beliefs and doctrine and whatnot. I really enjoy that. I think it's challenging. So there's of course differences there. I would probably find almost as many, if I went to a Baptist church, I would probably find almost as many differences in belief and doctrine in the Baptist church, because I'm pretty sure that you are not on the same page as everybody else in your church. But
and let me make a quick mention of that, because I have never been in a church where everyone really agreed much on anything. I think a lot of times people just avoid asking questions or getting into it. But no matter what church you go to, people hold different beliefs on different subjects, whether they're brought up or discussed, or whether that contention or disagreement is encouraged or discouraged, might be different. But I mean, Caleb, I've been to your church down in Texas. I'm assuming you're still going to the same one that I visited, right?
Yep.
I've seen all the people in your pews. I guarantee you there are different beliefs there.
Right.
My church, it's funny, my church is made up of families that have come from every walk of life. There are people that came from Catholicism and Lutheranism, and the church was actually started by, I forget what it was called. I think it's called the Church of God, but I don't remember. That's a group that has some distinctive beliefs, and I don't remember what they are, even though I've had the conversation before. I'm a very strong independent Baptist. The church that I go to is actually Southern Baptist. So there are a lot of differences in the whatever church you go to, and I really don't see a problem with it. There's honestly only one belief that I think is imperative. We all have to believe that we get saved by faith, by grace. It is by faith you are safe. It is by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, so it is the
I'm glad you finally got that out, since that's the most important belief.
I know it's the most important verse in the Bible. Or
if Joe Biden needs a running mate, I'll give him your number.
Yeah, if he needs a speech therapist, just send him my way. I can improve him by about 800%. Okay, so that's Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. I think so long as we all are in agreement as to how we get saved and go to heaven, I think from there we can move on. If our second belief is that the Bible was written by God and it is the final authority, I think we pretty much, it's like, great, let's start a church. Those two beliefs, good enough. We can argue about the rest, but at least we believe that we get saved through the work that Jesus did. We have faith in him, and we believe that the Bible is our sole authority. I think we can move forward from there. Okay, so let me try to answer this question, and then Caleb, I'm going to give you another one. What constitutes a true church? How would you define having church? So I think the true church was as simple as a group of believers that would meet corporately for the purpose of worshiping God and growing closer to God. I think that's as simple as it was. It was a group of people that all wanted to be a part of each other's lives. They loved God, they wanted to worship God, and they wanted to do that together so that they could have that support. The iron could sharpen the iron. The threefold cord would not be easily broken. Excuse me. So I think that's as simple as it was, and what constitutes a true church? Again, I think it's just a group of believers that love each other and love God and meet together in order to carry out those two purposes. So fulfilling the great commandments, number 1 and 2. Beyond that, we could try to start adding, details to that. But if you can get a group of people that meet together somewhat regularly, okay, how often? I don't know. We could argue about that. I don't think the Bible is that clear on it, but tries to get together and meet somewhat regularly for the purpose of loving one another and loving God together. I think you got yourself a church. If you have a leadership rise up where someone feels called to lead and the people are behind that person, you could call them, the preacher or the pastor. If that preacher or pastor is able to have a deacon or an elder, those are certainly positions that are talked about in the Bible. Whether you want to go that route or not, or whether you're big enough to do that, that all remains to be seen. But none of that happens unless you have a group of people that love each other and love God and want to do it together. So I think it's that simple. Okay, so Caleb, we have another question.
Before you go on to the other question.
What do you got?
Oh, so I had only made it partway through my answer, and I probably got off on a rabbit trail talking about the differences and how we can have differences. But so this is one of the things that I would look for the most in a church, and this would be if I was church shopping or if I was thinking about who I would consider as a brother or sister in Christ. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that Jesus constantly refers to the church as his bride. Yep. And what I would say, if you look through the 10 Commandments, if you look through the Bible over and over and over again, God is constantly looking for a people that don't divide their attention between him and somebody else, him and something else. Mm-hmm. And so being linked together with other believers that you can look at them and without question, where they cast their anchor, that they belong to God, that they're set apart as his bride, that they're not cheating, they don't have somebody else on the side. They're not living for themselves. And I know, and I'm going to go ahead and say this. I know people that are in denominations that are pretty far off doctrinally, but I know people that are in some of these denominations where I would look at it and I would kind of cringe if I was to think of joining their church. But there's some of them that I see as very, very devoted to God. They are wholeheartedly set apart as the bride of Christ, where they look at him as they have the type of commitment that I like to see in a Christian. And it's pretty obvious when you see somebody that's kind of loose in a marriage. You can look at them and you can say, hey, she's flirting with other people, or she's, running around. You see that, and you see that in Christianity too. And I don't think that God looks at it much different. We can have kind of a loose standard as far as holiness or what we think of in Christianity. But when it gets to a marriage, you see somebody running around and you're like, oh, that, we can all scoff at that. Even in our fallen society that we're in, that still doesn't look right or kosher. But yet with Christians, there's a lot of Christians that I would say, I really wouldn't want to be in a church with people that are just go to church on Sunday kind of Christians that really don't live for God the rest of the week. So I would say, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but one of the things that I really look for isn't where somebody falls doctrinally this way or that way, or how much we agree on stuff, but finding a people and a group of people that can meet together regularly, where you can look at each other and and you feel confident that, well, number one, you're born again believers, but that they are really committed to Jesus, and that you can unmistakably see that they are the bride of Christ. So I would say the true church, that's what God is looking for when he returns. If you look at what Jesus says it's going to be looking for, is a spotless, pure, spotless, no blemish bride. And really, we can't be perfect, but we can be perfect in our dedication and in our loyalty to God, to where there's no mistaking that we are his. So I would say that would probably be the clearest thing that I could see that Jesus says he's going to look for at the end of the age, is a spotless bride. So that to me is what really makes up the true church, is a spotless bride. Everything else is kind of up for grabs.
Peripheral. Okay, so Johnny asked a question here. What do y'all think of a home church? Is there a benefit in home church? Okay, so I'd like to talk about this because my wife and I have talked about this several times, and honestly, one of the main reasons that we are in a church that meets on Sunday morning in a church building is for our kids. Because keep in mind, we have been in many different types of fellowships over the years, and we have done home church, and I've done home churches at other people's homes. I've done them in my homes. And to be honest with you, I really enjoy a home fellowship. I love a small group of, however many families, maybe 4, 8, or 10 families that can get together and worship God together in a home. I love that. And there are a lot of people who have never tried it, and a lot of people I think are scared off by it simply because it's different than what the mainstream is doing, and I understand that. But you do have to understand that you didn't really have the big church building that you all met at on a Sunday built by the church people. That didn't come about until about 800 to 1000 AD. For the first 750, 800 years after Christ, that's the only place that churches met, was in homes. And if you read the Bible all the way through to the end, and you read about eschatology and the end times, what you find out is that that's where they're going to meet again. And the reason in the end is the same reason in the beginning, which is going to be persecution. So what you're going to find out is that the church is going to be persecuted more and more as the years go on and we get closer and closer to what we would call the biblical end times. And Christianity, once again, true Christianity, is going to have to go underground. And that's already happened in many countries. I had a friend of mine who she was a missionary over in China, and all she did all day, every day, was smuggle Bibles into China for the underground church. And in China, there are two churches. There's one that is that is public, and you can go to. There are church buildings, but there are government operatives that are in the church, that run the church, that spy on the church, that know everything that's going on. They keep track of who shows up and take attendance and the whole thing. And then there is what is called the true church over in China, which is underground, meets in secret, is often persecuted. And, those are the meetings that get broken up, and they steal their Bibles, and they arrest people and beat people and kill people and all kinds of terrible things. So this underground church and this home church already exists around the world. It will exist in this country again as America starts to persecute Christians the longer this goes on. But if I had my way and I could do anything, I would meet in our home church on Friday nights, okay, which would be what we would call Erev Shabbat. We could have a meal together, and then we would do a home fellowship where we would probably alternate different homes, depending on the number of families that were with us. We would probably alternate as far as having a teacher. So it would be much more in the style of the way the Jews met in temple during the time of Christ, where different leaders of the family would take turns, teaching the Bible. And we would kind of go along that route. And one of the things that we would really enjoy is having our entire weekend, so we can really take the day off on Saturday and relax. And my wife and I could enjoy each other and enjoy the farm. And then, on Sunday, we usually use it as a work day, and I hate that I have to go to church on Sunday mornings because it really gets in the way of the day that we dedicate to working around the house and doing projects around the house, which we really enjoy doing. So my dream would be a home fellowship on a Friday night, and I even have some friends in this town where they're like, man, if we didn't have kids, we would be there. I mean, it's a nice time. And if you don't want to try a home church, that's fine. If you feel God wants you where you are in your church, that's good. Stay there, but just understand something might come up in your life. Something might change. Your church might fall apart. That happens. The pastor could do something immoral, or one of the people, the church secretary could steal all the money, and the bank forecloses on the building. These things happen. Crazy things happen. And if that ever does, just remember, God's with you. God loves you. God loves all the Christians there. And you can still make the thing work, even if it's a little unorthodox. So for me, I really like the home church model. I've had very good experiences with it. It is different. There are a couple good books that you can read on it to kind of help you navigate some of the weirdness and the pitfalls and the different things. And the only thing that I'll add to this, and I'll shut up, and Caleb, you can take over here, is that when a home fellowship grows to a certain number, the best thing that home church can do is split into two. Because usually people kind of join the home church they like the closeness, they like knowing the names of all the members and the names of the children, and praying specifically for the people in the congregation that they love. And then it grows, and they're like, wow, we really got a good thing going here. Let's all chip in and rent a space in a strip mall and start a church. And then all of a sudden they grow up to 50 or 100 people, and they're like, man, we don't like this anymore. And people leave and they start another home church. So one thing that, I've had suggested to me is when your home church grows to beyond 25, 30 people, figure out who feels like they're being called by God to start another work, and just split the thing, right in half, or one or two families go off and start a new one, and the one group can support the other to try to help them, win some new families and get them going. And it can be a wonderful experience. It can also be a train wreck. Okay. Just like the church you're in now. Okay. And the next church you go to visit, it can be a wonderful thing, or it can be a train wreck. So, remember, it's mostly about, are we going to be loving and selfless? And are we going to want to worship God and put others ahead of ourselves? Or are we going to want to be selfish brats? And depending on our attitude is probably going to dictate how successful, that home church is going to be. Caleb, I've taken up way too much time. Why don't you jump in?
Oh, no, you're good. So the comment thread here, it looks like my wife and her cousin are just going back and forth having their little
Yeah, no,
family
that's great.
reunion.
Yeah, Rue, I really appreciate you and your friends just using our message board to chit chat about your day and how the kids are doing. I mean, I was
We have more
concerned.
comments than views at this point, so that's probably great.
Everyone's going to see this video. They're going to be like, wow, 8,000 comments. People were really engaged. And they're going to get halfway through and it's like, hey, can you send me that banana bread recipe that you had out last weekend?
So I must say hi, McKenna. It's good to see that you're on here watching.
Oh yeah.
All right, so
no, I don't think she's watching so much as reading what your wife is writing. I don't doubt that the two of them have the volume off at this point and they're just reading each other's comments. Okay,
no,
Johnny,
that's just fine. So
and Josh, I hope we answered your question to some degree. If we did not, please let us know. We'll try to clarify.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you've had any experience, Patrick, with home church aside from Messianic Jewish home church or not. That's probably one of the biggest exposures that I had to it would have been that. But some of the best memories that I have of home church is really the first church that I really got to really be a part of or go to. And I still am good friends with people that I went to this home church in, and it was only about 4 families. And of course, then they went on from there, and some of them ended up as pastors or assistant pastors in other churches, that type of thing. And I saw those churches go through splits and, all kinds of problems. And I look back at those days where we were meeting in homes and we were singing together as families, and really, really good times, where it was just the simplicity of just gathering together and worshiping God. And I think that sometimes as an organization gets more and more official and it gets bigger and bigger, you can kind of lose that first love where it's just, you gather together, you love each other, everybody there, you really care for each other, you work together, you're excited because everybody has a part. And then as the organization grows and grows and grows, you have the differences of opinion, you have different things that happen over time, and things become more political and you can end up with division. And so I honestly am very, very much a huge proponent of small church or home church, one or the other. And I personally don't really think that church has to be, of course, pastors are ordained and things kind of get passed down the line, but also a lot of tradition gets passed down the line along those ways with official church too. And some of that tradition's good, some of it's not. As a general rule, any tradition, whether it's good or not, can become bad when it comes in front of God or obedience to his word. So I do find that in home church, there can be an openness to really having a hunger and thirst for righteousness, opening God's word and reading it, because there's not necessarily a set tradition that you have to stick with. So I have seen the possibility of them being more Bible based, more there's very little operating expense. There's no overhead with a home church. And so you really can bear each other's burdens, help each other out, do that type of thing with your money, or if you raise some money together from people's tithes or offerings, that money, 100% of it can go to support missionaries or different things like that. So you can
afford to buy a lot of razor wire and Kool-Aid in a home church. I mean, you can buy it in bulk. It's wonderful. So keep that in mind. You can buy a tract of land somewhere in the middle of Nevada where none of us have ever seen it, and just set up a fence, and start stockpiling Bibles and firearms and all the things the church needs. So I want to make sure that everyone understands what direction we're going here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the input. We're down to 5 minutes, so that was valuable input. Thanks for that. On Saturdays, we just started a comedy podcast. And you could go on there and quote scriptures and whatever all you wanted to on there too. Yeah. Anyways, no, I honestly think it can be really, really beneficial. But then at the same time, I also see the benefit to the regularity and the trustworthiness of having a church that is dependable. I've seen most home churches come and go. They don't seem to last. They kind of, you stick around for a while and then they move on. Things kind of break up. And that bothers me a little bit, I guess, in those circles. I wish that there could be enough dedication that people could really stick together. There's so much diversity usually in home churches that I find that sometimes people get off, in the weeds with something and they end up jumping ship, and they move on because they didn't really know what they were in for, and they thought they were going somewhere else. At least if it's an established church that's been there 30 years, you kind of have an idea of what the church direction is going. And the other problem is a lot of people that fall into home churches are people that are pretty strong-willed, people that don't fit in somewhere else, and so they want to fit into a home church.
Yeah. So they can do whatever they want. Yeah.
And they also think they can shift.
Yep.
They can steer the ship in the direction that they want it, and then if it doesn't go there, they get disgruntled really fast. So it is, I think it can be beneficial, but I have also seen the downside. And I've been a part of 5 or 6 different home church groups that I've fellowshipped with from time to time. So.
Mm-hmm. No, there's because there's not a lot of people, it's easier to have less accountability, and it's easier to get off in the weeds. So, one of the things that Paul recommended to Timothy was that, he understand that his youth would be a detriment to his love of God, because experience helps. And being a little older gives you a little bit more wisdom, and people are going to be more apt to listen to you, and it's easier to get off on something weird and crazy if there are not many people there, and if all the people there are younger and have less experience. It's nice to have 1 or 2 folks with gray hair, in any group to help kind of keep you from going off into the weeds, in any direction. Okay, there's another question here, Caleb. So I wanted to jump in on this and ask it to you. Okay, so Corey was asking, do you think that we might be missing Jesus and in all his supremacy, and that our love relationship with Jesus might be, lacking in many of our churches? So, what do you think?
Short answer, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So my short answer would be yes as well. And one thing Caleb was talking about, Caleb really doesn't sound like he's a big fan of a very large church. And I can tell you, I think I'm really in agreement with you there. And it's so easy to get your focus off of Christ and onto programs and onto a million other things. And a big church and its bureaucracy is much like the federal government. There's a whole lot of can we and not a whole lot of should we. So all they do is just write a big list of, what are the things we can do? And it's like, well, maybe we should ask if we should do these things, and if a church has any role in these things, or if a church should get involved in any of these things. And really, we were talking about earlier, the true church would be one that comes together because they love God, that, they love Jesus, and they want to worship him. And I think it is easy to get off on doing a million things. I mean, even in the book of Revelation, when we read about the 7 letters that Jesus wrote to the different churches, one of his biggest complaints was that they lost sight of their first love, and they got busy doing other stuff, but it wasn't loving Jesus, and that was one of his greatest condemnations.
So we've officially hit our 1 hour mark, and there was something else that I had wanted to get to, but I think I can quickly say it here, and that is there are a lot of Christians that are gonna be going to church, that are listening to this podcast, and your church is going to use all of these things that we just mentioned that you need to go to church for. They're going to use these things to try to convince you that you are Patrick. You cannot answer questions. All right. So somebody asked what denomination I was, and Patrick says that I am Wiccan. Anyways, I don't even need to answer that.
And our listeners agree. They believed me.
They're like, so.
Yep, pretty obvious. Look at the shirt he's wearing. Look at his headset.
Anyways, So back to what I was saying, our need for one another can be abused by specifically heavy-handed churches that try to control people and steer you into believing that your salvation comes through them rather than through Christ. And so obviously we need each other, and I think Patrick and I are big advocates for, having the interaction that we have in church, the accountability, realizing that 9 out of 10 people that don't go to church and have all these good scriptural reasons for why they're not going to go to church, most of you are probably living in sin, and you don't want the accountability, because if you go to church, somebody else is going to call you out on it, and you don't want that. And so a lot of people, that they come up with every other reason in the book to show why they're not going to go to church. And really, there's probably things in all of us that are off in our lives. And when we're around other people that are walking with God, those things tend to come to light. And so if we're just going to hide out from God being able to deal with the issues in our life where we need to be changed and molded and shaped to be more like him, because we're unwilling to have interaction with other people, that's the wrong reasons. But also, don't let it be abused in the other way, thinking that that just because you're a part of a great church and that they convince you that because you're a part of this church that somehow your salvation comes through that. It does not. Your salvation comes through Jesus alone. And a lot of churches are going to try to abuse this idea of corporate salvation through the body of Christ, where you cannot have Jesus except for we, write you the prescription for Jesus.
Yeah. And remember, Jesus settled that when he died on the cross. He made it very clear that there were no priests anymore. Okay, he made it clear that you don't go to the priest and bring them the sacrifice, and they perform the sacrifice, and they burn the incense, and they do it all for you. No. Nowadays, we are the priests. Jesus said that. Peter said that. Okay, saved people are kings and priests, which means there's direct access to God. We don't need to get to God through the church we go to, through the pastor that we go to, okay, through any podcast of a couple of Craigslist level morons that are talking about the Bible every Friday night.
Hey, speak for yourself, man.
Okay, we have direct access to God. All we need is to pray, and the creator of the universe hears us and wants to hear us. And if we have a Bible, that's even better, because we can learn everything that we need through those two means. You certainly don't need that priesthood anymore. And unfortunately, that's the same trick the devil's been playing on people, for thousands of years. He's been telling them the same lie, that you can only get to God through a system, that really he set up.
Yeah, so that's Patrick misquoted. He said that I was a Craigslist level Christian idiot. So I just want to clarify this. Somebody else asked what denomination I am. So I'm non-denominational. I read Christians for Dummies, and then I started a podcast. So.
Yeah, but and keep in mind, the Christians for Dummies he was reading, it was written in Spanish, but it had a lot of pictures. So I think Caleb did fine figuring it out. He got through that book a couple of months ago, and here we are. So Caleb, if you had to like for me, I was raised Catholic, and then when I got saved, I ended up in what I would call a fundamental Baptist church, and that's really where I've associated most of my beliefs as far as what would most closely describe my beliefs. For you, you were raised in what we would call more, why don't you tell it instead of me trying to recount, your history.
So my dad grew up Jehovah's Witness. My mom was Mormon, and they were born again in a Pentecostal church. And it was kind of an offshoot from the United Pentecostal Church. And then my dad and mom they were there for, 6-8 years. My dad left somewhere along the line. My mom stayed. And that church would kind of consider themselves more like Anabaptist, along the lines of Anabaptist, but they come from the Pentecostal background, so they are self-sufficient, farm with horses, that type of thing, kind of down to the earth, basic people. And so that's the background that I came from. And then my parents went from that to no church. We grew up just doing home church. So it's kind of, I used to go to the mall and hand out Bibles, and people would ask, "Wait, what church are you from?" Because we weren't a part of a church. So when I would teach music lessons, I'd had money that I'd set aside, and I wanted to tithe that money, but I started supporting missionaries, and they would take that money and go take a trip down to the beach and hand out a few tracts in Cuba or wherever they went. And
Hawaii.
I found out I was basically funding somebody's vacation, and then they handed out a few tracts while they were at it. And I was like, well, I'll just go buy the Bibles and hand them out myself. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I would meet people and they'd be like, well, what church are you from? Or, obviously you're trying to promote your church. And that was one of the things that I felt like God was able to utilize with me, is I really didn't have an agenda of growing my church or growing some denomination, because I was just handing out Bibles because I wanted people to know Jesus. And so some people would kind of let their guard down when they found out I wasn't associated with any church. I wasn't trying to promote myself. I wasn't giving them my phone number. I was just handing them a Bible and saying, go home and read it. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the things that I was like, man, this is pretty cool. Well, then I moved to Texas, and I attended a Mennonite church for a while. And then my wife and I were one of a few couples that started it's Rosewood Bible Chapel, is the church that we go to now. And so we were, my wife and I were the only people originally in the church. I mean, it was only a few of us to start with, but we were the only ones that hadn't come from a Mennonite background. Everyone else was Mennonite. So at the time, we were, I'd say 33% non-denominational, 66% Mennonite. Now, this last Sunday, we had, I think, 70 people at our church. I'm thinking, wow, it's time for us to branch out and plant another church, because it's getting too big. I'm really the minority now. But anyway, so that's the background that we come from. It's kind of this mixed bag at our church. There's people from here, people from there, mostly Mennonite at our church. But I would still consider myself to be non-denominational, even though I go to a church that's predominantly former Mennonites, whatever. And so and of course I have no problem with Mennonites, but the same goes for pretty much any denomination out there. I'm leery of getting caught up following after a man, especially a denomination that names himself after a man. It doesn't matter how good the man was. If your group names yourself after a man, I kind of cringe at that a little bit, because we're supposed to be followers of Christ. That really is what defines me as a Christian, is I'm a follower of Christ. And so I would say to anyone,
like my church because I'm a follower. We named ourselves after John the Baptist.
No, I didn't say anything about your church.
Who Jesus said was the greatest man among men. Is that?
No, that's fine. Your church is the greatest. Yeah, no, that's great. It's good to know that you go to the greatest church. That is the biggest problem, though, with any church, is when you get to the point that denomination is the only denomination or the best denomination.
The only one. Yeah, you got it.
So no, I've gone to Patrick's church. I have no problem with his church. Yeah. So anyways, that's that. I guess denominationally, I would say 100% I'm a follower of Christ and nobody else. And I would also say Patrick and I are sitting here advocating that you go back to church on Sunday and you listen to your pastor preach, even though we believe your pastor is probably dead wrong on half of what he says, and we're dead wrong on half of what we say.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and just for the record, I didn't put the event up yet, but we just made our list of the next 8 events, and there's actually one coming up, which is, what do you do when you know your pastor is dead wrong? That's actually the title of one of the ones we're going to do. So I think that one should be exciting. Caleb, we are almost at 1:10, so I think we should sign off and let everyone have their weekend. Any last words?
No, I think that pretty much does it. Go back to church.
Okay, that sounds good, everybody. Shabbat shalom. We'll see you next week.
Shabbat shalom. I must